The Walking Dead audio comic is presented in episodic order. If this is the first episode you're listening to, please go back to episode 1 and listen from there. The following podcast is for mature audiences only. Listener discretion is advised. Previously on the Walking Dead audio comic. The group mourns the loss of their friend Amy, who was killed in an attack on the camp the previous night. Jim, who was also injured from the attack, starts to get sicker and asks the group to abandon him somewhere where he cannot harm them. Shane and Rick get into a massive argument about what happened at the camp when Shane punches Rick in the face, knocking him down. Lori runs to defend her husband, and Shane, not knowing what to do, runs off. Rick follows Shane into the woods, and upon catching up with him, Shane explodes into a fit of anger and points a rifle at Rick. He declares his feelings for Lori and tells Rick he has to die. Carl comes to the rescue by shooting Shane in the neck, killing him. And now, issue 7 of the Walking Dead audio comic. Lori stood off the side of the highway next to a line of abandoned cars that had tried to get into the city of Atlanta. She stared at the lights of the city that shone brightly through the dark night. Several cars behind her, Shane approached. "Lori?" he called out to her as he got closer. "Carl's fast asleep in the car. It's the first time he slept since we hit the road 2 days ago." Lori continued to watch the lights of the city as she replied, "Good. He seems to be taking things as well as can be expected." Shane stood directly behind her now. "Are you okay?" he asked her, concerned. Lori turned back to look at him and replied, "Look at it. The whole city is overrun. We can't even get in without being attacked. My parents are dead. Everyone that came to the city for protection is dead. They'd have to be. Nobody could survive that." She turned her head back to look at the city again and continued, "And Rick, 3 weeks he's been in that coma. He doesn't even know that this has happened. And we left him to come here for this." Shane lowered his head, thinking about his partner, and then reached out to put his hand on Lori's shoulder. "I'd suggest just going back for him, but he's safe at the hospital. It's the safest place for him, and we can't help him in his condition. Besides, the government is going to start cleaning this place up soon. Near a major city is the best place to be." As Shane laid his hand on Lori's shoulder, she lowered her head and replied, "Oh, Shane, I can't thank you enough for coming with us. Carl and I would never have made it down here on our own. I'll never be able to repay you. I don't know what's going through your head, but I'm a wreck. I don't really know how to explain it. With all that's going on with Rick and my parents and the world, don't take this the wrong way, but I just feel so alone." As she finished her sentence, emotion overtook Shane, and he reached in and kissed her full on the mouth. Lori pushed herself slightly away from him, closed her eyes, and turned her head as he looked on in surprise at what he had done. "Lori, I'm sorry. I didn't mean," Shane said, and turned his head away, feeling ashamed at what he had done. "I'm sorry." Lori opened her eyes again and replied, "No, Shane, Don't apologize. Everything we've been through, everything we're going through, I understand. She looked over again at Shane. Shane, I need you. Shane pulled Lori over to a grassy hill just off the side of the highway and laid her down there. I need you, she said as he got on top of her. Oh, Lori, Shane said as he began to make love to her. I've wanted this for so long. The two interlocked their fingers and stretched their arms out to the side. Shane looked down and kissed Lori as they continued long into the night. The group gathered, their heads down in front of two makeshift grave markers. One was for Amy, the other for Shane, his police cap hanging off the side of the cross that marked his final resting place. Lori stood closest to the grave, wearing a police jacket, her arms folded and her head down. Rick, who was holding Carl behind her, lifted his head and said to the group, All right, then. The group turned and slowly walked off back towards the camp after giving their final respects, except for Lori, who stayed in front of Shane's grave with her head down. Rick stayed behind as well, holding on to Carl, waiting for his wife. He eventually gave up and wrapped Carl in the raincoat he was wearing to keep warm. As he got a little ways from her, he turned to look back and then caught up with the rest of the group. With the group off in the distance, Lori lifted her head and spit at Shane's grave as hard as she could. An intense look of anger crossed her face as she said, You son of a bitch. As the group of survivors walked along side by side, Alan said, What a day, huh? Lori, she's taking it harder than the rest of us. I guess with the trip down here, him taking care of her and Carl, she trusted him. Hell, we all did. Rick, who was walking next to Alan, turned his head towards him and said, I never would have thought him to be the one to snap like that. He just lost it. Rick turned his head back to look at Lori, who still stood at the gravesite, and continued, He was my friend, probably my best friend. This shit we're in is not to be taken lightly. If you can change a man like Shane so drastically, we're in deeper shit than we thought. I better hang back. Let her catch up. We'll talk later. Later that night, Rick approached Dale's camper to ask about Andrea. Dale stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, trying to keep warm. As Rick got closer, he said, How's she doing? Dale replied, Better, but it's going to be a long time before that poor girl is going to be back to normal. Rick looked up to Dale and asked, Dale, do you think any of us will ever be back to normal? Dale stepped outside the camper and walked towards Rick. After today? Not really. And speaking of which, and I'm not saying this to say I told you so, I saw this coming. Shane's been changing since you arrived. I think he was in love with your wife. Rick closed his eyes and winced slightly. He knew Dale was right. He had known it since Shane pointed the rifle at him in the woods. I know. The things he was rambling on about before he tried to shoot me, that's all that makes sense. Dale now stood directly in front of Rick, a serious look on his face. Yeah, but what I'm getting at is that everyone in the camp was starting to get wary of Shane. The attacks, Amy, Jim. We are ready to move this camp, Rick. We let Shane call the shots because he was a cop. I'm an old man, Glenn's a kid, Alan, well, he's not leadership material. We need someone to look up to make us feel safe, especially the women. I talked to everyone earlier. We think that someone is you. Rick took in everything that Dale had to say to him and replied, Okay then, get some sleep. We're moving to camp tomorrow. We've been here long enough as it is. Oh, and one more thing. Andrea's been keeping track of days since this whole thing went down. Unless she's messed up along the way. Dale paused for a moment, then continued, Tomorrow is Christmas. Rick reached out and grabbed Dale by the shoulders and with his voice raised said, Don't tell anyone. Do you hear me? I don't want anyone to know. I don't want to have to explain to my son that on top of all this other shit, Santa can't find him. Let's just skip Christmas this year, okay? I don't want to upset the kids. Dale looked at Rick with his mouth open, shocked at his response, and replied, Okay, understood. Carl slept soundly, covered under piles of blankets and coats to keep warm, holding tightly to the hat his father had given him. Slowly he opened his eyes, still sleepy, then suddenly sat up fully awake, sensing someone in the tent with him. Just next to him, Rick had sat watching his son sleep. You slept pretty late, Carl. We're all almost done packing up for the big move. You doing okay? Rick said to him as he gave a slight smile to his son. If you ever want to talk about what happened, you can talk to me. Carl leaned on his arm as he sat up and replied, I know, Dad. Rick continued to look at Carl and said, So if you ever want to talk, you'll let me know, okay? Carl looked at his father for a second and then shook his head affirmatively. Uh-huh. The group gathered by Dale's camper, having collected and loaded as much gear as they could. They huddled under coats and blankets to fight back the cold as they got ready to leave the camp they had called home until the events of the preceding days. "We all ready to go?" Rick asked the group as he stood in front of them, his hands on his hips. Glenn, who was standing next to Carol and Sophia, replied, "I just need to get the gas from the cars into the RV. We'll be ready to hit the road as soon as Dale's ready." Dale, who was standing next to Andrea, said, "I'm all set. We can go right after we've gassed up." "Okay, everyone. Take a good look around the camp and make sure we're not forgetting anything," Rick said as the group got themselves prepared to leave. "And then let's get the hell out of here." With the group settled inside the camper, Dale put his foot on the gas pedal and started the journey away from the camp. "It's a bumpy ride, but we'll be fine as long as I take it slow. We should be on the road in no time," Dale said to Rick, who stood next to him looking out the windshield. "Thank God the snow lit up, huh?" Rick said as he turned his head to look at Dale. "He's got to stop shitting on us sometime, you know?" Dale replied as he glanced over at Rick. He turned his attention back to the dirt trail they drove down, on their way towards the highway, and a new beginning. Later that night on the dark highway, Rick, Alan, Glenn, and Dale pushed the car out of the way, the only illumination coming from the headlights of the camper. "We almost there?" Glenn asked as he worried about the darkness. "Just a little further, and it'll be out of the way," Dale replied as he steered the car off the road. "We don't have to get it completely off the road, just stay out of the way," Rick said with a wince as he struggled to help push the car. Dale looked over at him and replied, "Then I think we've about done it. You guys can give it a rest." As Rick and Glenn leaned against the car, Alan stretched his back out. "Whew! I don't think I could have lasted much longer." As the group of men made their way back towards the camper, Dale pointed down the road at a group of figures moving towards them in the light from the camper. Rick?" Rick pulled out his gun and aimed it down the road, surprised at seeing the shadowy figures. He yelled over to the others, "Look around! See how many there are! We don't want to get surrounded!" From out of the darkness, 3 figures emerged into the light shining from the camper. Whoa, hold your fire," an African-American man wearing a winter hat and heavy coat yelled out as he held up his hand towards Rick and the others. Behind him were a younger African-American girl wearing a heavily padded jacket and a young white man with glasses. Rick lowered his weapon and said, "Oh, geez, man. Oh, God. We could have killed you." As the man got a little closer to Rick, he replied, "Sorry to sneak up on you, especially in the dark like that. We were walking across the field when my daughter Julie saw your headlights. We don't see a lot of people. Live ones, at least. Not anymore." As Rick got face to face with the man, he reached out his hand. "Yeah, I hear you. I was starting to think we were it. I'm Rick." The man took his hand and shook it. "Tyrese, and this here is Julie and Chris. You guys have any food?" The group emerged from out of the camper and made their way over to meet the new people they had come across. With Dale close behind, Rick and Tyrese kept talking. "Julie and Chris are going steady. Dating. I don't know the correct term anymore. Anyway, Chris was staying with us when everything started going to hell. Family problems. Long story. We had a pretty good setup before we ran out of food and it got cold. Without heat, our house was as cold as outside. We didn't have a fireplace or anything." Tyrese dug a spoon into a can of food that Rick had brought him and continued. "So a couple of weeks ago we set out in search of food. We thank you for what you got here. We haven't eaten for a couple of days." Rick looked over at him, a slight smile on his face as steam came from his mouth in the cold. "Don't mention it, man. It's just good to see a new face. Listen, we're calling it a night here soon, and I'm sure we can make some room in the RV for you if you and your kids want to stick around. Just for tonight, or longer. I think it's safer to be in groups. You're welcome to tag along with us." Tyrese looked at Rick for a moment and then replied as he pointed his thumb at the abandoned car the guys had just pushed off the road. "That's kind of you, Rick. But if it's all the same, I think the kids and I will probably just sleep in this car over here." His voice lowered slightly. "They're not too comfortable around strangers." Rick turned and started walking back towards the camper. As he got a few steps away, he turned his head back to look at Tyrese. "You understood. We'll see you tomorrow then." Rick reached the camper and opened the door to get in when Lori approached him from behind wearing a blanket around her shoulders. "You're just inviting strangers to sleep in the same room as us?" Rick looked back at his wife and replied, "He's got kids with him, Lori." A stern look crossed Lori's face. "So do we. Don't be so trusting, Rick." The next morning, Tyrese and Rick sat atop the RV keeping watch and getting to know one another as Dale made his way down the road to some of the abandoned cars to search for gas. Sorry about that last night. One minute I'm telling you we haven't seen anyone, the next I'm using kids are afraid of strangers as an excuse to not sleep in the RV with you. It's just, you never be too careful, you know? You guys could have been traveling cannibals for all I know. Tyrese said to Rick as he looked down the road for any signs of trouble. What changed your mind? Rick replied. Without turning his head, Tyrese replied, The jury's still out. Rick turned to look at Tyrese and said, Yeah, I understand what you're saying, though. This stuff changes people. I just watched my best friend flip out and try to kill me not a couple of days ago. I never seen anyone act like that, let alone him. I was so shaken by seeing the change in him, I almost didn't even realize the danger I was in. I think we've got some good people here. I think we're getting by okay, but honestly, I just don't know what anyone's thinking. To me, that's scarier than any half-rotten ghoul trying to eat my flesh. Tyrese took in what Rick had said and then turned to him. A couple weeks after all this started, first time we ran out of food, we made a run down to a country store about 2 miles away from our house. We got there to find the place torn apart. It's been looted 3 times over, but there were stray cans all over the place. It seemed safe enough, so Julie, Chris, and I split up, looking the place over to find as much food as we could. There was this nice old man, got to be at least 60. He was always sitting in front of the store with buddies chatting away about God knows what. Nicest old man you'd ever meet. Always had a kind word to say. While we were separated, he got a hold of Julie, pulled her into a back room. Seems he'd be living in the place. We had no idea that anyone was even there. Tyrese turned his head back to look down the road again. This sweet old man, the first thing he thinks of when he finally sees other people, tries to rape Julie. Had I been 2 minutes later when I found them, he'd have done it. I killed that man, Rick. I wanted to, but I didn't mean to. I beat on him, and he died. Rick just looked at Tyrese for a moment and then replied, Jesus, man, don't beat yourself up over that. You did what any father would have done in that position. I may be a cop, but I don't let rules blind me to what's right and wrong, especially in light of our current situation. Tyrese turned his head sharply to look at Rick again. I'm not beating myself up because I did it. I'm beating myself up because I don't feel bad about doing it. Yeah, the end of the world changed him, but look at how it changed me. Off to the side of the RV, Rick heard a noise and turned to see what it was. He gritted his teeth as he said, Oh shit, roamers. Roamers? Tyrese asked as he turned to look as well. Rick explained, Oh, yeah, when we were camped near Atlanta, we went into the city. Most of the zombies just sat around, not doing anything unless provoked. See, most of them were content to sit and do nothing unless something happens by them. Then our camp was attacked. A pack of those things just tore through us, killed 2 of our friends. So gotta think that there are other kinds of zombies that roam around, always on the move. I figure roamers is as good a name as any. Rick started to make his way down the ladder, the back of the RV. Come this way. We gotta do something. Rick got to the ground and reached for the axe on his belt as Tyrese made his way down the ladder. We've got an axe in the RV if you want to grab it. Guns might attract more of them. Tyrese reached down and pulled a hammer from out of his belt. This hammer has worked fine for me so far. Rick and Tyrese made their way to the open field where the 2 roamers were, and before they got too close to them, stopped. We need to split them up. You go that way and try to get that one's attention, Rick said as he pointed past Tyrese. Gotcha, Tyrese replied and started moving away. Hey, ugly, over here. One of the roamers groaned as it looked over at Tyrese. Suddenly, they both turned in his direction. Shit, looks like they're both coming for me, Tyrese said as he quickened his pace. I'm on it, Rick said as he sprang to action. As he ran past the roamers, he bumped one on the shoulder with the axe to get its attention as the other continued towards Tyrese. This way, buddy. The creature groaned. Good save, Tyrese called out as the creature that was following him made a grab for his coat. The creature groaned again as it closed in on Rick. Rick called back to Tyrese, Okay, let's do this. Rick swung the axe into the head of the first creature, while at the same time Tyrese buried the claw of the hammer into the head of the other. Both creatures fell to the ground lifeless in front of the 2 men. From behind the RV, several of the group came out to see what the commotion was. Rick turned back to look at them and waved them off. We're fine. It's all under control. After gassing the RV up with what Dale was able to find, the group, along with their new friends, started down the highway once again. Rick made his way up to the front where Dale was driving and said, If we're not at least 20 miles from Atlanta now, we're really damn close. Let's start looking for some houses or neighborhoods and get off the highway. Will do, Dale replied and turned the camper off the next exit. As they made their way down the exit ramp, they came to a quick stop as two crashed cars blocked the road. The men climbed out of the RV to survey the situation. Jesus, are we even going to be able to move this mess? Rick asked aloud. Tyrese, who stood behind Rick, replied, "It might take a while, but I think we can." "Well, let's get started. It's going to be dark in a few hours." The group managed to get the cars out of the way and decided to set up camp in a secluded area in the woods just off the side of the road. They started collecting firewood before it got dark. "Man, I'm glad we ran into you when we did. Even with using the RV to do most of the pushing, I don't think we could have cleared that wreck off the road without your help," Rick said as he walked next to Tyrese. Both men were carrying bundles of firewood. Tyrese looked over at Rick and replied, "I'm just trying to pull my own weight, Rick. I'm glad you people are letting us tag along." Dale, who was collecting firewood within earshot of the two men, looked up. "Well, so far I gotta say, you've come in handy. Aside from Rick, I don't think any of us are really all that strong." "I know pushing cars out of the way was a lot harder before you came along," Glenn said as he arranged the branches in an easy-to-carry pile. Carol, who was walking past the men, looked over at Tyrese and said, "You're not too hard on the eyes either." Tyrese smiled and looked over at Carol. "Right back at you, Carol." That night, the group sat around the campfire close to the RV as they talked and ate their dinner. "You guys sure do have a lot of food," Tyrese said as he finished eating. Rick looked over at Glenn and said, "We've got Glenn to thank for that. Before we left, we'd been stockpiling canned goods he was getting from Atlanta." Glenn looked back at Rick and replied, "I was just doing my part." Carol was sitting next to Tyrese and looked over at Glenn, who was sitting across from her. "Oh, don't downplay it so much, Glenn. Without you, we'd be much worse off. We'd have to rely on hunting way too much. You're a lifesaver." Tyrese also looked over at Glenn as he put his hand on Carol's leg. "I've got to agree with the lady, Glenn. I haven't eaten this well in weeks." Carol looked over at Tyrese with a seductive look, and he gave her a smile. Glenn put his head down, dejected at what he saw. "The fact that he risked his life every day for the good of the camp, that's honorable," Rick said as he continued to look over at Glenn. "As a guy who's seen him in action, I gotta say, Glenn really knew what he was doing in that city. If he hadn't been there when I first got into Atlanta, I probably wouldn't have never found Lori and Carl, if I even survived. Rick stuttered for a moment as Lori had gotten up, wrapped in a blanket, and walked away from the group. He had caught her out of the corner of his eye as she left. "Hold on for a second, guys," Rick said as he got up. "Lori?" he called out to her as he started his way over to where she stood staring into the darkness. As he got closer to her, he once again said, "Lori? Lori, is everything okay?" Lori closed her eyes, looked down, and finally choked the words out. "No, Rick. I'm pregnant." This podcast is not endorsed by Skybound, Image Comics, or Robert Kirkman. It is intended for entertainment purposes only. The Walking Dead, all characters, names of characters, or other Walking Dead related items are registered trademarks and or copyrights of Skybound LLC and their respective trademark and copyright holders. The official Walking Dead site can be found at www.thewalkingdead.com. Songs: The Descent, Steel and Seething, and Undaunted by Kevin MacLeod. The main title theme by Gene Grasso. The Walking Dead audio comic is narrated and performed by Gene Grasso, and all original content of this podcast is the intellectual property of Eugene Grasso unless otherwise indicated.